All right, we are live. This is Hangops Part 2 for the week. It's the holiday extravaganza. Uh, it is December 19th, 2014. We've got a awesome topic today. Crap, I better put out the links for people so they can actually watch. Yeah, so we're going to be talking about how to contain ourselves on the desktop with Linux with a special guest, Jesse. Uh, Is it Frizzelli or Frizzell? I don't actually know. Oh, you gotta unmute yourself.
Sorry, Brazil.
It's just Frizzell. Okay, cool. So yeah, we got Jesse Frizzell. Some tweets that she had been doing recently, and just like stuff in her GitHub repo and stuff, sort of inspired this topic. So why don't we start with a little bit of an introduction, sort of on who you are, and then we can get in a little bit to. Uh, we'll start with kind of like assuming you have Linux on the desktop and the idea of containerizing your desktop, and then I'm sure the conversation will also sort of expand a little to just like Linux on the desktop laptop and why that seems to be making a little bit of a resurgence right now. But so yeah, just why don't you start with sort of who are you? How did you get involved with containers and Docker and all these cool things that you're doing, and let's kind of then go into containers on the desktop.
Cool. Sounds good. So I'm Jesse. I work at Docker. So I love containers, but previously before this, I worked at a startup in New York called they did web hosting for data scientists. So we used Docker internally for that. And so that's how I got introduced. And before that, we used LXC. So I switched us over. It was like a steering team to Docker, like on, and it's pretty great. Although we were using it like when you weren't supposed to be using production. Ever since then, though, I had like a love for containers, and I ended up like switching my Mac over to Linux like a while ago, and I used like GNOME desktop stuff like that, and then I realized that it was just like felt super bloated, so I ended up switching to i3 and running almost everything in containers except for like Chrome for stuff like this, which clearly isn't working because my audio is all messed up. But yeah, I basically run almost everything on my desktop in containers. It's pretty awesome.
So what would you say is the biggest benefit of having containers on the desktop?
I would say it's nice to just be able to like an app and know that it's fully gone from your system, because otherwise you're gonna have like random dot files places with preferences, and just like if you're gonna like apt-get purge something, like it's actually always gone. Like there's places, so it's nice to know that when you're killing the container, you're killing all of it. Especially like when I containerize like transmission to torrent legal things, it's nice to know that like it's fully gone from your system.
That makes sense. Like, just in general, okay, so I'm gonna like devolve very quickly into random things. So no, we hear a lot of the bitching and moaning about the curl bash stuff, and I always laugh because the same people just go download packages or just download random Docker containers and run them, and it's that same idea. Like the best benefit I keep hearing about containerization for this type of thing is like it's now inside, like you know everything that was done, even if the random script post-exec script does stupid things like start MySQL.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So can you describe a little bit about your like what this sort of workflow looks like, and a couple things that come to mind in terms of details would be, you know, sort of how X Windows, that stuff communicates, and then also sort of persistence, like whether it be a Firefox profile or your email. I think you use Mutt. That stuff. You just like doing volumes. Like how complicated does that kind of stuff get?
Yeah, so it's super app specific, which kind of sucks because when I was first doing like Chrome, I had to figure out where the data was stored so that every time that I ran Chrome, I didn't have to like relog into Gmail, the cookies again. So it's really a matter of seeing where that volume is first. You can just like run in the container, kind of poke around, and start mounting different volumes to see if that's going to work for keeping it persistent. It's really kind of like a guess and check unless you're really familiar with the app and know where the data is stored. But I end up just mounting things like I think Chrome has a data directory where you can say where it is. So I usually will mount like a dot folder, like dot Chrome, and then put that to wherever all of Chrome's persistent data is. But it's also nice because if you do want it not to be persistent for some sort of reason, you can just not mount it. But yeah, there's that. There's also, if you're gonna, different apps use different things. So like when I run Skype in a container, I actually use SSH and X11 forwarding, that's the only thing that I run in a container that I do that. Usually I'll just mount the X11 socket into the container, which works pretty well. Skype is a little bit interesting because it's actually like it's not like AMD 64 architecture. It's I think like 386 or something. It's just, yeah, things get weird actually with different apps, but you kind of just like guess and check as you go, and it's like more fun than anything else. But yeah, figuring out like just honestly, if it's dot files, actually, I do. So for like Erisi in a container, I mount the dot files into the container, so that's persistent. Random like command line tools, like I use T for Twitter in a container, and there's like a .t RC file, like I'll mount that into the container. Just stuff like that. It's pretty. If you just start stuff in containers, it makes it pretty easy. But like it gets scary when you're about to like mount your GPG keys into a container for Mutt so that you can assign someone's key. That I would not suggest doing. It's funny. I don't know if you guys know Paul Tagliamonte, but I was telling him that and he like almost cringed, but he also laughed. So I wouldn't consider doing that very often, but yeah, just be careful what you mount.
Interesting. So now, I believe you're a Debian user, right?
Yeah. Totally.
Are you using like images from the registry for this stuff? Or are you building like your own like Docker files from scratch that are based on maybe like a Debian image that you maintain that's sort of in sync with what's on your sort of base OS, right, that you boot into to keep everything like consistent?
Yeah, I usually start from Debian Jessie only because it's pretty small base, not because that is my host architecture. It technically doesn't matter, but yeah, I just am also a big fan of it because it is my name. But yeah, you could honestly use anything. I think for a couple I used SID just because I wanted some experimental packages and stuff and to pull from that. But yeah, actually also for Go binaries, you can use a super small base and just you need libc. But other than that, you can just throw the binary in the container, and it can be like one of the smallest images you have. It's pretty awesome.
Are you just using some trusted builds from the community or from Docker for your base images?
Yeah, from Docker, the trusted Debian Jessie.
Okay.
Builds, yeah.
Because one of the things that comes to mind here, I think comes to mind when people start playing with Docker, is like they're like, oh, like I want to grab this Zookeeper image and this Kafka image and that Cassandra image, and like, but they don't realize maybe all three of those have different base images. Like maybe one's CentOS, one's Ubuntu 12, one's Ubuntu 14.04, and then all of a sudden they've got like 7 gigs of layers lying around.
Yeah, yeah. I like my stuff to be super small, so I keep that in mind for sure. That's why I especially like go binaries because you can just have libc and that's it. Also, if you look at like TAnon's packages on the registry, there are some with like a assemble and one assembly, like one script, and it's a binary, and it's like so small. It's like, I think it's the smallest image on the registry. It's like TAnon Sleeping Beauty. It's just like a true. But stuff like that is pretty cool. But I would definitely be careful because I mean, I even have a few images that are like a gig and a half, and it's kind of cringe worthy.
So how much of this workflow came out of like uh, this is cool and I want to try to do it, uh, and then you've just stuck with it versus like, you know what I'm saying? Like I guess like the practical side of it, like like is would you say that this is something you'd encourage anyone that's maybe a Linux power user to try? You know what I mean? How much of it is like practical versus it's learning exercise and because of what you're doing and you're working on Docker core and stuff like it keeps you sort of close to the you know what I mean like close to what you're doing.
True, true. Like I do like it because it allows me to be able to test like the master build of Docker because that's what I run. But I honestly would consider it for anyone running Linux because it gets to the point where your setup is so minimal that if I have a problem and I am running like a release candidate kernel and it basically breaks everything on my system, I can spin up my exact setup so easily just by pulling down all the images I use and rebuilding them. So it makes like starting from scratch all over again super easy for me. Although I guess technically if you weren't running things in containers, you could script all that out. But I mean, who has time for that? Yeah, it's nice to know that the things that are running in containers and they aren't going to break something else because you get, before I used to get into issues all the time where something was depending on something else and it was the wrong version because some other app needed some, and then things were clashing and it would never work. Of course, I still run into weird stuff, but it's different issues now because I am trying to do so much stuff in containers that's not technically supported. But yeah, it is more of an experiment and fun, but they are building entire operating system, like the Project Atomic hosts, off of everything in containers. So I think that's almost where things are headed. I don't know exactly, but it's nice to know that things can be completely removed and not affect your entire system.
Definitely, definitely. So with stuff like Mutt or T, what is your path into those? Are you running like tmux and like Docker exec, or what's the sort of that look like?
So those containers are actually pretty simple because they don't require the X11 socket. So I'll just have the container run, and its entry point will be T, the command itself. So it's really just like a Docker run, remove, so that it nukes itself when it's done, and then it will enter the T command, run whatever I did, and exit. So I have aliases, a lot of alias on my host for T will actually do that Docker run, and it will take whatever arguments I put after it into the Docker run. In a TTY, and then
you're really breaking up there.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we lost you at T is the run, the entry point.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so the T container will enter at T, and whatever arguments I pass to the rest of it will it's usually T update, and then what
Oh, we lost her. We'll wait for her to rejoin.
While we're waiting, I've got a question. How do
Yeah.
you how do you all like handle running Linux on the desktop? Because like I've tried, granted it hasn't been recently, and it just makes me cry. Like, not that OS X is much better these days because I feel like I'm restarting it regularly, but um, the idea of running Linux on the desktop still, yeah.
What do you find frightening?
Um, this thing called battery life is really the biggest thing. No, in fact, it's actually interesting. For me personally, it's that realization of like switching over to a Surface tablet isn't really feasible for me right now because of the number of things that are in the ecosystem that I don't really want to change. Like I used things to track, to do apps, or to do things.
Mm-hmm.
And then the iOS integration, that kind of thing. It's always kind of like, but I wonder if it's, for me personally, if it's I'm connected to the Apple ecosystem, or if it is the switch to, I just don't want to have to manage my computer in the same way I manage servers. Like, I feel like I would spend a lot. I felt like when I was running Linux on the desktop, I spent a lot of time like messing with settings and messing with running the operating system instead of like writing code.
Yeah. So I used a Mac for the past 3 years as my primary machine, would do all my dev and everything on it. And just last week I purchased a new laptop, and now I'm running Linux on the desktop again, so I'm about 1 week in. And before using a Mac for about 3 years, I was Linux on the desktop for quite a while. And things have actually gotten a lot better from when I was past doing it. So I don't, run Skype and Docker or anything like that yet. But things like battery life have definitely come a long way. Like all of the APCI modules that you could have to control, how long your battery is going to charge and at what point is it going to stop and start charging while still plugged in is pretty convenient. I really like that. It took me a little while to figure out exactly what was going on, but other than that, I really like the workflow of having Linux on a desktop because I don't have to fight with a buggy Mac OS ecosystem anymore. I do miss things like iMessage, don't get me wrong, and I've got a lot of little bash scripts that I've written to try to replicate as much consumer-oriented functionality that I could. So, I've got key bindings for quickly taking like selfies of myself and my cats, or like screenshots and things like that. But for the most part, one of the primary driving decisions behind going to Linux for the desktop was primarily all of the responses I've seen from people who have installed Yosemite recently, and all of the quirks involved in that. So I'm pretty satisfied. Again, I'm only about a week in, but I find myself to be a lot more productive, to be honest.
I think it also a lot depends on what distros you're using, because I mean, in the past I had bad experiences with certain distros and better with others. Now, I mean, at my work we're almost entirely a Linux on the desktop shop, and so that's really interesting to me because the amount of progress that config management tools have made to make that management side of things a lot better. I've been doing that at my house as well for a long time now, where all of my Linux boxes at home all have, Ansible playbooks that I kind of go through to make it easier to set up and get running. And then shared .file repos have been amazing when I discovered that. I mean, it's the same on the Mac where you can get the .files and you can make homebrew, I forget what they call the packet, like the meta packages to install all your stuff. But there's still some sort of complexity to that as well. I mean, it's just kind of an iterative process for me where I, started a long time ago just like, oh, I want to tweak this one little thing. And I didn't just tweak it. I made sure I tweaked it in something that was repeatable the next machine I was on. And for me also I switch between probably 3 or 4 computers regularly that also it forces me to make things repeatable across all those machines, where I just go to my machine, I git pull, and I have all the same settings I had on the other system.
Yeah,
So
our business is we're a puppet shop, and we use Boxen to configure and deploy developers' laptops, which is just like running Puppet on OS 10. And so I took my work desktop, which is Linux on the desktop, and I'm converging it with Chef. So I just have my configuration and everything else managed through Chef.
So I'm in sort of a middle ground right now where I've got a headless Linux box at the office, right? It's desktop hardware that I use, and I run a number of things inside it with tmux. I just get access to it over VPN. And I have a similar sort of sized hardware at home that I recently built with the intention of trying to ease into sort of actually with Linux and a GUI and a window manager and everything was my main interface. I'm still sort of mostly using OS 10 for GUI stuff and doing things inside tmux on it as I'm sort of figuring out, because there's like a short list of like OS 10-y apps for me that I'm using that I'm also using on iOS would be Evernote, OmniFocus, which is to do this tracking, 1Password, right, which is password management, and then just sort of there's a general like OS 10 looks nice. I've been using OS 10 as my main GUI OS since 2003. So it's like it just looks really nice, and it's also like there's a lot of sort of those like GUI habits, Command W, Command S, Command V, Command C versus like Control. But I also like use Emacs for something, so like caps lock is Control, but it's like a whole different set of like I use a lot of like the Control A, Control E, Control D like stuff because that works natively in a lot of text input in OS 10. So there's those two sort of humps that I see is like some of these like GUI things I'm dependent on the app, but I also use the app because it looks really nice, and that's just part of what I like. So I'm trying to like make that transition. I think part of that is actually going back to more CLI stuff, like MUT, Emacs, and this CLI only Emacs, basically stuff that I can use inside tmux.
I kind of miss the old, and I guess it was a version of Ubuntu. It's been a long time, but like when you grabbed the window and it did the thingy. You guys know what I'm talking about? Where like you grabbed it.
Yeah, that was Compass.
Yeah, Compass had a wobbly Windows plugin.
Yeah.
Yes, that was awesome. But all kidding aside, so actually, you guys, so Justin actually hit one of my bigger things right now. Is I'm running well, I've got a laptop that sits on my desk that pretends to be a desktop, and then I've got my actual laptop that I carry with me day in, day out. And when I switch between the two, that is what's killer. It's the, what's the word I'm looking for here? Like, I end up in this state where I ran Test Kitchen on my laptop. I've got the instances converged, and then I go over to the other laptop, and it's like, oh, those aren't there. And I've been kind of like going back and forth, kind of pondering the idea of going back old school and like having in college, or I've heard them referred to as timeshare machines. I mean, in other organizations, they're called bastion hosts. But that idea of like, I'm just maintaining an instance in the cloud that I SSH to, and then from there, load up tmux and do all my stuff. Since that's, I mean, basically all I'm doing locally anyway is just connecting to a local tmux session. I've thought about kind of spinning up an instance, and leaving it running and connecting to a tmux session there. Does anyone have any thoughts on that kind of thought process of just running all of it from a...
That's how people work from iPads, right?
Yeah.
So that's, I think, part of what I'm doing with like, having these two Linux desktops, one for home, one for work, and trying to shift more. One of the things for me, right, is having that split also means now I've got two places to maintain stuff. But also, even if I go, say, full Linux desktop and GUI and everything at home, right, I still have an OS 10 laptop I foresee still running OS 10 on, because there are some things, media type things I still want to do with OS 10. But also, like, I travel. And so I think that gets a little bit to like what you're talking about is like if you shift most of your work that onto that, like how do you code on a plane? Or like what do you do on a plane? Like how do you work offline? Or if just like, you're splitting your work between two machines, how do you sort of keep workspaces in sync and stuff like that?
Well, and that's what I do with shared dot files repos, where I can, not only pull down my settings and shortcut keys and scripts and stuff like that, but also using other config management tools. I have at work, I don't, at home I have a laptop and desktop Ubuntu, and then I have a Mac laptop for work, and I have a Red Hat desktop at work, and it's just, I go between all, three different platforms.
But what about
I need to.
code that's in flight? Like say you're working on a personal project, do you try to keep it in sync between the two, or do you just be like, I'm going to read on a plane, or like, I mean, like maybe that's a micro optimization of like trying to work offline.
I don't travel as much, so I don't have I don't need to be offline as often as probably some other people. But I have, private repositories, places that I can stick stuff, and before I leave somewhere, I push it up there and I check it out on the next box.
Yeah, and that's where I'm at right now. It's the code in flight problem. I'm working on a new cookbook, and I'm midway through it. I get the phone call from my wife that, hey, can you head home and then pick some milk up on the way home? And it's like, sure. Crap. Okay, well, I don't really want to even destroy these instances because I'm right in the middle of like experimenting, and I don't want to commit this code up to the repo because it's not working. Even like pushing it up as a branch seems wrong because I'm adding a commit that like isn't complete. So that's where I've struggled and been kind of pondering. To your point, Brandon, I guess my attitude at this point is if I'm sitting on a plane, I'm rarely actually doing things that, like, I need so much, maybe this is just because I suck at coding, but I need so much documentation and like the interwebs to be productive coding that I end up just doing things like reading. And my pro tip for travel is actually I've got a Ruby Tapas subscription, and I just download a bunch of my Ruby Tapas videos before I get on the plane, and I go and I sit for like an hour and watch those, and then play some Bejeweled.
Well, that's where, like, having Linux on a desktop right now, like, I'm using Arch and Awesome, and so I have my Linux desktop running as a server, as a media server, and I actually took a blog post, and I'm using my Linux desktop as a local time machine as well. So, my fiance's laptop and everything backs up via time machine to my desktop, but also I have a OS 10 laptop that I use for work, and then I can work from my couch or anywhere else. With that laptop, just SSH into my Linux desktop, and I have that still same work environment. I have that same workspace that I had on the desktop.
Do you maintain enough on the OS 10 machine though to be able to work directly from it?
Yes, and that's where like Boxin comes in, where Boxin is just like a one-liner curl to bash.
Yeah. Okay.
But like what I noticed with like Linux, like when you were talking about the prettiness of OS 10, like yeah, I miss it, but then like I don't need prettiness to work all that much, and I found like I spend a whole lot less time on like Twitter and stuff doing pretty stuff because I spend like most of my day in a terminal anyway.
Yeah, same here. And for me, I'm the opposite, where I cannot stand OS 10. I don't like how it looks. I don't like how it functions. I don't like that the keys are backwards on the keyboard compared to everything else. And so my Mac laptops and desktops, I really use them. If I need to, I will only SSH into them. I've been using GNOME 3 for a long time now on most of my desktops. I mean, say what you want about how it started and everything, but I think it looks really good now. It functions really well, and it's really fast, and it has a lot of it has some problems still, sure, but so does OS 10. And then all of those, like the ecosystem apps that you guys are using for that do kind of lock you into using OS 10. I mean, I because I hated OS 10, I intentionally used web-based apps for all the things, where I used Remember the Milk for to-dos, and I used LastPass instead of 1Password, and all these other things that were web plugins and websites rather than needing to rely on any sort of underlying OS.
There are like hacks you can do to make Linux prettier too, because I know that was really hard for me as well. Like I have a strong importance on like font rendering, because if I can see the pixels, like that's a problem. But the Linux on my Mac, that's a MacBook Retina, is so pretty that like people will often come up to me and be like, "What are you running? Like that looks like crisp and like clean." So I mean, there are like certain things that you can do. It's not perfect, but it's still like whenever I use my ThinkPad, I'm like, oh, I wish this was Retina like my Mac. Like you can make it look good.
So that's a good little bit of a segue into a question that Diptanu had to drop from the chat, but he asked in IRC, what is the current state of Linux on Mac hardware? And Jesse, I believe you wrote a really good sort of overview post on that recently, but could you kind of sum that up for us verbally?
Yeah, so almost everything works now, with the exception of the camera. So like right now I'm on my ThinkPad, but I don't know if the Linux drivers are ever going to work for like the iSight camera, but that's the one thing missing. Everything else, in kernel 3.17, you could hot plug a Thunderbolt in and out, so that's awesome. Before that, you could, if it was plugged in, it would work if you started with it plugged in, but just hot plugging was added. And I actually have used my Mac hooked up to displays with the Thunderbolt hot plugging, and it's really nice. Yeah, it is hard to set up. It's not the most fun thing in the world. Like I would consider like drinking a bit beforehand, but it is possible. And I honestly never used the Mac side of my Mac anymore. That I ended up just removing it. So it's possible, but there are a lot of hacks that you need to do to get it to be nice. Like even just little things like that ping when you start the Mac, that noise that it makes. If you forget to have that hush login file before you nuke the Mac side, it won't be quiet. So it's just like weird stuff like that, which doesn't make sense, is interesting.
And do you have all those settings, the GUI settings and font stuff, saved somewhere so that you can repeat that later? Because that was one of the biggest things that I found was as soon as I was able to figure all that out, I figured out how to put it in some sort of config management, which worked really well in Linux. And then my next system that I set up, I just cloned it and applied it, and it worked for me.
Yeah, I have like a massive bash script so that whenever the Mac, the partition stops working, I can just nuke it and start from scratch again, and it will reapply all my settings. I probably could have done something more glamorous, but it works. So.
Speaking of the font rendering, though, I was getting like massive headaches because I rendered my fonts backwards. Because my monitor is the Asus PB278Q, which is a 4K monitor, and the subpixel rendering on the monitor is actually flipped. It's BGR, not RGB. And so I rendered all my fonts to be RGB, and it was just completely backwards, and that sucked.
That's intense.
And going back a little bit to the original talk about putting all your applications in Docker containers, how is that working out for you for GUI apps? That's why I was actually mostly interested in this talk, because some of the transition between different Linux distros with GUI stuff is where I run into more of a problem of how do we actually manage that and make sure that all the dependencies are inside the application for the GUI to run.
Yeah, GUIs are interesting. It's really on a per app basis. If it's something that's going to use like OpenGL, it gets super complicated because you need to be running like the same drivers inside the container that you are on your host, which kind of defeats the purpose of containerizing something in the first place. But other than that, stuff like just a simple GUI that's using like maybe ncurses or like something, it works pretty well. It's not going to pick up on the font rendering that you set on your host. So when I run Chrome in a container, I need to also set the font rendering in the container, which kind of sucks, and I never actually do. So I end up just running Chrome on my host usually if I want it to be pretty. But little things like that you have to just take into account and kind of deal with it. It's not going to be perfect, but it is better, I guess, than running it on the host. It depends, like, if it's worth it for you, I guess.
That's what I'm not sure at this point. Is I've been working a little bit on Dockerizing more intense GUI applications like 3D animation and more hardware intensive stuff. And I don't know how much Docker is going to have access to GPU rendering or multiple cores and more storage that it might need. So I wasn't sure if you had experience with that kind of stuff too.
Yeah, I've tried a couple OpenGL games just to see how it would work. Not 3D exactly, but just simple stuff, and it's not there yet. Like, honestly, simple GUIs are fine, but anything with OpenGL is you end up just wanting to mount like almost everything into the container, or installing basically everything on your host into the container itself, and it's still not great. So I've been like working on some hacks for it, but yeah, it's definitely not there yet.
And that doesn't seem like it's on any sort of roadmap either. That was kind of one of my other thoughts was, I mean, obviously Docker's not really, desktop, centric application to be running, to be doing it this way. It's more of a hack, and it's more of something that's, hey, that's pretty neat and that's novel, and it makes some portability for terminal programs, but it doesn't seem like something that actually has any legs to, rely on, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a hack. And when I have showed this example at like different things, people who run boot to Docker on a Mac are like, why can't I bind mount the X11 socket? And I'm like, that's not really how computers work. You would probably need SSH forwarding with X11, but this is not something that we technically support. It is more of a hack to show something cool that you can do, but it's not really the use of containers. But it is nice, and it's there. I mean, technically, I don't think we'd ever break the existing usage of it, because I use it all the time, and I know some people do. But it would be nice to get like OpenGL working, but that is, of course, not on the roadmap because it's not even a supported feature.
Yeah,
That
that
sounds crazy.
Josh, did you have another question? Do we lose him? Or Justin, sorry. Anyway,
I feel bad now.
you killed him.
I know, right?
One of the things I've been thinking about with this transition, and because, I don't know, for me personally, the last couple OS 10 releases have been less and less stable, I guess is the nicest way to put it. And I'm just finding myself a little, like, I feel like the power user sort of experience has gotten a little less than what it was. And most of the work I do is all Linux-based anyway. But I've thought, I have an iPad, I have a keyboard for it. So for some of the stuff like OmniFocus and Evernote and things, just shift them to my iPad and just sort of like go iOS only for some of that experience that I like, and then have the OS 10 in the corner. I was kind of thinking about like, what are my day-to-day tools? I do a lot of Evernote for like notes and research, and there's a web interface. And people have pretty good success with running the Windows version under Wine. So like, but I think like for some stuff, it might just be like shift that to use my iPad, which I don't really use much, as part of bridging that, because I'm not sure on some of that stuff how full like terminal I'm ready to go yet. And I think there are a couple like open source Evernote GUIs, but I'm just thinking like, there's a few things that I might just like shift to the iPad, other things I might replace. Like I'm looking at LastPass. Jake was talking that up yesterday. We were talking about password management stuff. One of the things I think I was leading towards a question, getting back to the containerize everything workflow that you do, Jesse, was do you just launch, say, like T or MUT in a terminal, or do you do them in a tmux window, or like what does that kind of look like when you're running those commands? And do you have like shell aliases that wrap around like the Docker run stuff for that?
Yeah, I have shell aliases for sure, and I don't use tmux or anything. So it's just a alias for Docker run interactive and tty. So yeah, the command itself, I'll do like a alias for mutt, and it will just be like Docker run -it my mutt image, and the entry point is mutt with all my settings, and I'll mount the volume with all the configuration settings that I have.
Do you have IMAP or mutt talking directly to IMAP, or do you use something like offline IMAP?
Oh, I have it talking to Gmail. Or yeah, I don't do the offline stuff mostly because I don't care that much. But there are like things that you can do for the offline. I just have so many emails that I didn't want to download them all in the first place. But yeah, I just look at the inbox usually.
Yeah, I pull mine in with offline IMAP into Mutt. Just because it's, I don't know, because it was more nerdy, I guess.
Do you have any like cron jobby type stuff that that you do with this, and have you done anything like with that with containers?
I do have a cron job that will download the latest Docker binary, but that's basically it. It's not in a container, but just make sure that I run the latest so that we can find bugs super easily. That's about it.
If someone wanted to get started with toying around with this, maybe look at what stuff you've done, where should they go?
I guess all my images are up on the Docker Hub, but there's like no docs for them, or even maybe some have like just the command that you run in it, but it's honestly not really documented at all. I was thinking of like writing a blog post maybe or something, or maybe just writing docs for them, but yeah, it would be hard based off just what's public. But there is actually 2 Docker files in the Docker repo itself under contrib, and then it's like desktop integration, which kind of shows us off. I updated them, so like one is Chrome and one is gparted. So that would be a good start, and then it would probably like lead into how the other ones work, because honestly most of them are just mounting the X11 socket.
I feel like you were talking, Brandon, but we couldn't hear you, or at least I couldn't hear you.
Oh, sorry, I hardware muted. So, what's the upside to Linux on the desktop? I'm just going to kind of throw that out there as like a closing topic. You know, desktop, laptop is like the upside to Linux is your main like day-to-day OS. Let's put it that way. What's the upside?
That's hard.
Or why do you do it? I guess maybe, you know, like personally, what you know,
For
why
me,
not?
it's that I can run everything that I would run on my server and have combined configs, and it's what I know. It's technically I do know like Unix from a Mac, and it's kind of like the same thing, but there are major differences, and just like things with IP tables and stuff that doesn't exist on a Mac. It's just more comfortable, I guess, for me, at least.
I suppose that argument can be made for any OS. Like, what's the benefit of Windows on a desktop or OS 10 on a desktop? I mean, it's all about the ecosystem and familiarity with the operating system and the tools. So if you're not familiar with how Windows works, then you're not going to run it on a desktop. But if you have Windows servers and you have Windows, everywhere else, and you use Windows tools, then use that on your desktop. But if you're using Linux everywhere else, and it's the command line tools and the software available on Linux is generally the same, not always per distro, but you can always kind of build it and make it work, where you can't always do that if you're switching between OS 10 and Linux. And if you need a lot of people have no GUI on the Linux on their servers, so they don't care about that ecosystem, I guess. But the tools that you're using to manage it are still the same if you're using Puppet or Chef or Salt or Ansible or whatever. So being able to use those powerful tools to manage everything everywhere is great, because I mean, we're at work we're using Puppet on our desktops and on our servers, and at home I'm using Ansible and Salt on my desktops and home servers, that kind of stuff. So I mean, the tools are everywhere. Where I don't necessarily want to learn OS 10 management for config management stuff, and I don't want to have to try to buy into that ecosystem and not have a tool available somewhere else.
That's an interesting point I had forgotten about, because I always seem to forget it, but that's a great point as to why you may run Windows or OS 10 is at this point, and maybe you guys can tell me I'm wrong here, because I would love for you to tell me I'm wrong, but at this point, if you're running Windows Server 12 or Windows or 2012 or 2010, I think, or whatever the dates are, I forget. The latest two versions of Windows Server, the RDP client that you use to connect to it, you can't run on Linux at this point. Like, there isn't anything that supports the security, or the last I looked, there wasn't. Is that still the case?
You have to change the servers to fall back to the Windows 7 style RDP methods, but the newer ones have a lot of new features where they do UDP-based RDP, which is really cool because it's super fast and responsive. But if you're using trying to manage Windows servers on a Linux host, like I used to do that, and I had a Windows 7 box that I would RDP into that, and then I'd RDP into the servers, because the environment there in the quote-unquote ecosystem was the same. And so I kind of would put myself in that mindset of, okay, I'm going to manage my Windows servers today, so I'm going to do it from a Windows box. And days that I'm going to manage the Linux servers, I'm going to do it from a Linux box, because it's more familiar and it's easier to not get caught up on those weird little, like, oh, this command flag is different, or this tool's not available, or yeah. So those kind of things just makes it seamless to go across different machines. And I mean, for me, at home, using Linux on a desktop isn't, I use it because it's free and I don't like the other solutions. I could just as well, if I liked, OpenBSD or something like that, use that as my desktop, and it'd be familiar enough or whatever if I liked it. At work, using Linux on desktops makes a lot of sense, because we're doing super high performance graphics and using hardware that's ridiculous, that we can't do on the other platforms, where we need to be able to tweak every little thing, and Apple's not going to give us access to low-level driver calls and everything else that we might need to do to be able to do what work that we're doing.
Well, and arguably in your case, like the compilation environment, if you will, ends up being important. So it becomes important that the environment that your staff is working on their workstation is exactly what they get on the server, because the software packages, all of that makes a difference in the rendering of stuff.
So, two things to maybe wrap it up. First of all, multimedia stuff. What's that like? And second of all, iOS. Are you an iOS user, and what kind of integrations are available on that side, or do you keep an OS 10 machine on the side for that stuff?
For me personally, I mean, media. I don't know exactly what you're talking about with media.
So, I don't know. Spotify, Netflix, Amazon Prime. Do you have your own video library? Like, what of that sort of stuff do you consume and care about?
I have a lot of my own stuff that I use, network storage at home, that I use strictly XBMC/Kodi for playback. That is like 90% what I'm doing if it's local stuff. Remote stuff, Netflix works now if you have Chrome. Chrome inside of Ubuntu only, if I remember correctly. They had the security stuff, but Netflix just works. I don't actually subscribe to Spotify, but I use Pandora and Songza and Google Music, which all run in the browser, and so I use a browser for all of my music playback. I don't necessarily need native apps for those kinds of things. And then I am an iOS user. I have tried to like Android multiple times, and I just don't. but because I use web apps for most of my stuff. They have apps available on iOS. Like I have a Remember the Milk app, and I have a LastPass app. Sorry, hold on. Train's coming.
Jake, Tom, you guys are relatively new. What is your mental calculus on some of that stuff?
So I sort of miss having the native Spotify app like I had on Mac. I have to run the web-based Spotify, and it Chromium really just like sucks a lot of memory. So if I'm doing some intensive CPU intensive or memory intensive things during the course of my workflow, sometimes the Flash-based Spotify will skip a little bit or pause the song for 1 or 2 seconds, which I don't really like. But as far as things like Netflix and things like that, I'm using the Pipelight, which allows you to compile Windows plugins for Linux browsers. So that all works without a hitch. So I'm not really deprived of my media.
Yeah, I'm just sort of curious because, like, for me, I think a lot of my media stuff has been pushed off to iPad, Xbox, Roku. Um, so a lot of that like is good enough, and then like I think still having OS 10 on the side makes that easy. Jesse, like, what do you?
I was never actually a fan of the native apps on a Mac, so I do use a lot of web-based applications, and then I have at my apartment like a server that runs Plex, and I do the web-based app for that too. And I have an iPhone. I actually used to have a Android, but then I got sick of it not working. So yeah, I mean, everything works via the web interface. I have a couple of like command line tools for connecting to my Plex server, but I honestly never use them.
Cool.
The one thing that I actually keep a Mac around for that it's better at than anything else is ripping DVDs and music and Blu-ray. Whenever I buy a new movie, I stick it in there and copy that over to my Linux server. That's kind of the one place that I rely on it.
So I don't even own a device that could where you could put a CD or a DVD or a Blu-ray disc into anymore. So I find that hilarious that you actually still do that.
When my internet goes down, my my wife and son don't want to. I mean, we have the discs still around, but getting those out and actually putting them in feels even worse. So being able to just see a list of it, and I have Plex running as well, just for sharing externally.
I was going to say the only time I use discs at this point is we have a DVD player in the car, and when we go on long trips, I put the DVDs in the car for the kids because that's the only time. That and when my wife brings home random DVDs of school stuff.
Cool. Well, I think this has been really good. It's kind of fun to like see the workflows, see to what degree people are doing stuff, and some of the sort of ways in which you can mix and match and replace the different like computing needs that you have. And I definitely think I'm going to continue sort of going down this sort of path of trying to become Linux as my primary OS and migrate and take a hard look at like each tool that I'm using and like, do I want to replace it? Do I want to move it to iOS? Do I want to maybe I want to replace Evernote with just like org mode or something, or just use the web interface. And there's kind of like there's a different like a calculus you can apply to sort of each of the tools that you use and how much I'm actually really using them and things like that. So.
And I also, along the same lines, I use Evernote. I just use the web client of Evernote. There is a crappy Linux client, but for me, my usage of it is fairly limited. I was using web-based wikis for a long time of my personal, so I would go to my own wiki and fill it out. That was only web-based, but I don't know.
I do think the availability of iOS and especially like an iPhone plus an iPad can make a lot of things. Can make a lot of the transition also easier for someone like myself who's I've just kind of gotten used to, almost addicted to the like fancy GUI, whiz-bangy sort of thing that iOS or OS 10 can have if you've been on it for a long time. You know.
My dependence on iMessage really dropped when I switched to Android, though. So.
Yeah.
And I am running Spotify natively. There is a native Spotify client. I don't have to run that in a browser, so it's pretty cool.
Nice.
Where did you get that?
AUR.
Oh, okay. I'll check it out.
I believe it builds it from a Debian.
If you're not using it, Tom, since you're on Arch, get Yowert. It's like a wrapper that will use AUR and then fall back, or it'll use Pacman if it's in Pacman. If it's in ABS, I think is the right term. But then also if it's in AUR, it'll just pull it down automatically. So it does like both.
Cool. Also, Tomcat's a really cool. It plays Spotify as well. You can log in with your credentials and also play YouTube and mix all your sources together, which is not Tomcat, Tomahawk. That's what I'm thinking of.
Oh gosh, yeah. Cool. Well, unless anyone has any sort of like parting words for someone who's like curiosity has been piqued by all this stuff, we'll wrap it up. But anyone have any little wisdom they want to?
I will say one thing. Just in the past week alone, when I was on a Mac, I used a lot of Vagrant to sandbox environments for testing the things that I was developing. And the startup time for VirtualBox was just a killer on my productivity. And now being able to just run all of that in a container is a really, it's a strong boon for running Linux on a desktop if you do a lot of dev work.
Are you using Docker for that?
I'm using Docker as well as sometimes just the LXC Vagrant for some pre-existing Vagrant files that I already had.
Cool. Well, awesome. Thank you everyone for your time, and especially Jesse. Thank you for the trailblazing and the thought leading that you do, both on the containerizing the desktop and the Linux on recent Mac hardware, because that stuff is very much there be dragons. So thank you so much for your time there, and that you share about it, and that's really cool.
Thanks.
And everyone have a good weekend. I mentioned a lot of you are going to have some vacation next week, so happy holidays and all that. And I might do just a informal thing next Friday. I'm going to be on vacation in in-laws, so we'll see how the internet is there. If not, we'll probably be back on the 2nd with just an informal hangout. So keep an eye on the Twitter account, and we'll see you next year.
Bye.